Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is well remembered as a civil rights icon who fought for racial equality. However, he's less remembered as a champion for economic justice. As an economic developer, his work in this area has specific significance and direct relevance for my profession. People remember the I Have a Dream speech, and maybe remember it was given at the March on Washington. But people often forget that the actual name was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And it's worth pointing out that the word jobs came before the word freedom. Why is that relevant? Because without economic justice, the freedom to walk in the front door of a store or eat at the lunch counter is meaningless if the poor can't afford the goods. In his I Have a Dream speech, within the context of Emancipation Proclamation, Dr. King said that, but 100 years later,
the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy.
Over a half-century after the Civil Rights Act, the black-to-white family income disparities in the United States remain almost exactly what they were in 1968. The unemployment rate for black workers remains about twice that of white workers. The median income of white workers is about 30% more than black workers. The median white family has 10 times the wealth of black families. Today, nearly 40 million Americans remain poor. This is over 10% of our entire population in the United States. There are many schools in which the majority of students do not have enough to eat. Most working Americans of all incomes live paycheck to paycheck, with over 1/5 struggling to pay their bills. While it might be thought that this is just a problem of the poor and those that have been historically oppressed by racial, class, and gender inequality, it's not. Nearly 40% of those with annual incomes over $100,000 live paycheck to paycheck, including 12% struggling to pay their bills. Poor, lower class, and middle class Americans are all acutely and personally aware that their homes, healthcare, education, and families are economically vulnerable. As a friend of mine reminds me, the system works exactly how it was designed to work. As economic developers, we have a role to play in making real Dr. King's dream of economic justice by creating an equitable economic structure for all Americans. During his 1965 sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Dr. King stated, "I still dream that one day all of God's children will have food and clothing and material well-being for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, and freedom for their spirits." As economic developers, let's make that dream a reality.